Hello, and welcome to a slightly unusual edition of Politics Weekly. I'm Zoe Williams. While our politicians are away on holiday, the Politics Weekly team are offering up the recordings from our Women's Seminar, hosted by The Guardian in May 2017 and sponsored by Pearson. The seminar was a way to remind us how gender equality battles are won and how progress is made. We got together an incredible lineup of inspiring women and one token man, along with a remarkable audience, to share past triumphs, current cri de coeur, tips and advice. In this first episode, you're going to hear from our keynote speakers, starting with award-winning novelist and passionate advocate for women's and LGBTQ rights, Elif Shafak. Following Elif is veteran MP Dame Margaret Hodge, who started her political career as a local councillor in 1973 and has worked in politics for over 40 years. In her time, she has been at the forefront of much of the progress that women have made, but she also reminded us how depressingly little things have changed. Here are the highlights of the talks from these two insightful women.
It's really nice to be here. I'm a writer, I'm a novelist, I'm a storyteller, and I like to take part in conferences, panels around the world, both in the Middle East and in Europe, in Turkey, in the States. And until quite recently, whenever I participated in a debate, I would be one of the most depressed speakers coming from Turkey, usually alongside my fellow Pakistani writers or Nigerian or Egyptian writers. We would be the depressed bunch. But that has changed, and more I hear writers, speakers from America, from Europe, including England, also carrying the same anxieties, concerns that we have been carrying for so long. And in that regard, I think countries like Turkey hold important lessons for all of us everywhere, because what has happened there can happen anywhere, it can even happen here, and we should not forget that. So perhaps countries like Turkey have taught us that time does not necessarily always go forward. There isn't always necessarily progress. That future is not necessarily more developed than the present. And sometimes actually countries can go backward. They can make the same mistakes. Generations can make the same mistakes that their ancestors have made. So that's circles within circles, and the decline back into nationalism, what I call tribalism, isolationism, paranoia, fanaticism, and authoritarianism, and it can happen anywhere. Again, the example of Turkey has taught us that democracy is quite fragile. It's much more fragile than we assumed. Because how do you deal with the kind of populism that comes to power by using the means of democracy? It doesn't come from outside, elected again and again and again, and once they are in power, use that power, once they consolidate their power, in order to suppress all the other voices. Populism, I take it very seriously. I find it very dangerous for various reasons, but I want to mention two of them. When they are in power, populist parties, as history has shown us again and again, they benefit from power. They benefit from manipulating the state apparatus. They benefit enormously from dominating the discourse, the main discourse. So power is beneficial for populist movements. But what happens when they're in opposition? Let's say they never come to power. Still, they have a power or they have an impact beyond their size. As we have seen, for instance, recently in the Netherlands. We were very happy that Geert Wilders could not win, but I think we should take a closer look at how it functioned. They had the power to change the rhetoric, the language of mainstream politics, so that even mainstream politicians, central right, central left, started speaking in a much more jingoistic, in a much more nationalistic tone, so that they won't lose their own voters to those far-right parties. So what I'm trying to say is either, whether they're in power or not, they have an impact beyond their size. And I think this should be a concern, particularly for us women, because when countries decline into authoritarianism or populism or isolationism, it is women who have much more to lose than men. Now, again, until recently, I heard many well-intentioned, with all the good intentions, academics, activists coming from Canada, coming from South America, saying to me and women like me, you guys need feminism because you're in the Middle East. And I always wanted to say and said, but it is universal. Patriarchy is universal. It's true, it's much more concentrated in some parts of the world, and therefore our struggle is much more acute. There's almost an urgency, but you also need it in Canada. You also need it in France. What has changed now, I think, and that's why it's a crucial moment, I believe, for global feminism, that perception has evaporated. And more women of different age groups are realizing that the rights that we have, we can't take them for granted, including abortion rights, including the fight for equal pay in the workplace. And of course, then there are the other problems that we find very difficult to talk about, such as incest, such as rape, such as domestic rape, domestic violence, etc. These are very universal. But that said, I'm also aware that in the region where I come from, it is far more intense. When you travel across the Middle East, including my country, Turkey, you will see the cities belong to men, streets belong to men, especially after certain hours, public arena belongs to men. And when you look at it closely, even though there are lots of strong women, vocal women, patriarchal countries do not necessarily mean that women are victims or passive, not at all. So even though we have amazingly resilient women, there's one area in which women are almost non-existent, and that is politics. And I think that makes a huge difference. So if you go to Turkey, you will come across women, strong women in art, academia, media, in all the disciplines. But when you look at politics, local, regional, national politics, it is very masculinist. It is very divisive. It's very aggressive. And the few women who exist in that, who manage to exist in that space, defeminize and desexualize themselves. And we do that all the time. If we want to be respected with our brain, with our thoughts, the first thing we do, we defeminize ourselves. And this also is quite universal. I am concerned because across the Middle East, I think women, unfortunately, are being pushed back into the private space. We are being told again and again that our primary job is motherhood, that we should focus on our careers and leave the dirty job of politics to men, as if they are doing us a favor by keeping us in the clean space. I am worried because I hear more and more Middle Eastern politicians saying that gender equality as a concept is not suitable for our parts of the world. In fact, we should be talking about gender justice, which is more appropriate to Islam. They say in Islam there's gender justice, and by that they mean if everybody sticks to their own roles, it will be a just and fair society. I find it very dangerous that we're losing even our concepts. And of course, the word feminism, unfortunately, has a big negative baggage in the part of the world where I come from. And it concerns me. I am a feminist. I have huge respect for generations of feminist movements and theories, always plural. But I'm also aware that the word feminism, unfortunately, does not travel to far east, especially towards the Middle East and the East. And sometimes I think, without abandoning the word feminism, is there another word I can use? Is there another word that has more access to different parts of the society and perhaps has the potential to bring women from different backgrounds together? And I think that word is sisterhood. Yeah, it is a lighter word, and I'm not saying we should abandon the word feminism, of course not, but let's keep sisterhood in mind, in our souls. And I want to share with you perhaps also my own story, my own personal background, which maybe brought me to this point. I was raised by a single mother in Turkey, which was a bit unusual at the time. I was born in France, in Strasbourg, and shortly afterwards my parents got separated, and I came to Turkey with my mother. Now, my mom, she had married at the age of 19, thinking love would be enough for her. She had dropped out of university, so by the time she came back with a toddler in her arms, she had no diploma, no money, no career, and no place to go to. And in this state we came to Ankara, to a very conservative, very patriarchal Muslim neighborhoods. It was the house of my grandmother. And usually young women in my mother's position would be immediately married off to someone, usually someone older, because they're not virgins anymore, right? So they're not very high on the marital market. And the society sees such women as a threat to their order. And that's what people try to do, immediately looking for suitable husbands for my mother. I remember that, all of those encounters as a child. And it was my grandmother, my Eastern, less educated, very traditional, very irrational, spiritual, superstitious grandmother who intervened and said, you know what, you shouldn't do that. You should go back to university. You should graduate. You should have a diploma. You should have choices in life. And then if you want to get married, of course you can, but then it will be a choice. It won't be an obligation. So that's what my mom did. She went back to university. Afterwards, she graduated with flying colors. And all those years, I was raised by my grandma, whom I called anne, which in Turkish means mother. And my own mother I called abla, which means big sister. So it was very confusing for other people. To me, it's just the way it was. The reason I mention this is because my mom is very well educated. She's urban, secularist, modern. She never got married. She always was an independent woman. And my grandmother's choice and decision changed not only my mother's life, but also my life. Now, the woman who did this was not well educated, herself was not very Western, but there was a solidarity between them. And that's what I call sisterhood, yeah? So for me, that solidarity is crucial. And I think at this time in history, we have to expand global solidarity. I sincerely believe women's movement needs to go hand in hand with LGBT movement. This has been one of our biggest deficiencies, especially in some parts of the world. Homophobia and misogyny go hand in hand. Societies that are extremely patriarchal, deeply patriarchal, also have a very negative, deeply rooted negative attitude towards sexual minorities. It's not a coincidence. It is the same ideology. We also have to see, unfortunately, how we women sometimes play a role in the continuity of patriarchy. Because patriarchy is not a black and white system in which men oppress women. It's much more complicated. And ironically, patriarchal cultures are also cultures in which there are strong matriarchs. Yeah? So when you look at the focus on the house, across the Middle East, but in other parts of the world as well, you will come across very strong old women, yeah, the matriarch in the house. And these women, in the eyes of the society, again, they are defeminized, again, they're desexualized, and that gives them an additional power. But what do women in that position do for younger women? Do they use their position in order to support them? They usually don't. Because the idea is, I suffered, now it's her turn to suffer. And so we can never break this chain. Unfortunately, I also observe this in the workplace. Many women think in order to look tough, we have to defeminize ourselves and never support your sisters because that will be discrimination. I think that's wrong. I think we need to go back to the basics. Just remember the solidarity, the sisterhood that naturally existed between my mother and my grandmother and expand it. Because one of my biggest concerns is across the world, we are being told by all extremists, and this they have in common, although they might seem very different. So if you talk to a fundamentalist, Islamic fundamentalist in the Middle East, or a far-right member in Germany or in other parts of Europe, one thing they have in common is they all hate multiplicity. They all hate plurality. And they want to reduce us to one single thread of identity. So they say, are you a Muslim? Be a Muslim according to my definition of Islam. Are you Dutch? You can only be Dutch, nothing else. But the women's movement, especially of 1960s and 70s, particularly African-American women's movement, which I always admire, one of their main strengths was they were so comfortable with multiplicity. Also because they were women of color, they cared about class issues, they obviously cared about feminism, they cared about LGBT issues, so multiple belongings and multiple concerns. When you read the poetry of people like Audre Lorde, she says, I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a lesbian, I'm a poet, I'm black, I'm this, I'm that, and I'm many more things you won't see when you look at me. but I carry it inside me. So what we've lost, I'm afraid, is that kind of emphasis on multiplicity. We can have multiple belongings. We don't have to be reduced to one single tribe, one single thread of identity. And I think the resistance against that kind of singularity, which lies at the core of all populist and extremist movements, the resistance against that will come from women, will come from global feminism, global solidarity, and global sisterhood, hopefully. Thank you so much.
I'm always challenged by these things and I'm too short. Can you see me? I've got the confidence. I'm always a glass half full rather than a glass half empty person. I always start with that. So things in my life, I've now been in public life for over 40 years, have got better. But. The discrimination and inequality that we face, I think, is still rife. I think our gains are under constant threat. I think we have to be very vigilant. We think we've had victories, but they very quickly dissipate. I think the need for feminism, and I'm a non-apologetic feminist. I think it's really important, actually, we call that out. I think that is urgent, and the battle for equality remains really tough. And yesterday I was speaking at an event that IPPR held on local elections, and I'm chairing at the moment a commission for the Fawcett Society on women in local government in the UK. And actually it shocked me because I started my public life in local government. I'll tell you this, and things have just not changed enough. We've still got only a third of representatives in local government are women. There's only been a 5% increase in that over the last 20 years. That is simply shocking. Look today at the metro mayors. Where are the women? These are new institutions, an opportunity really to create equality and of representation, and we have failed to grasp it across all the political parties. And if you look at leaders in local government, less than 1 in 5 of leaders are women. And yet, think about local government, 4 out of 5 people who work in it are women, and of course lots of the services that are provided by local authorities are particularly relevant to women's lives. Now, the story I want to tell is I became a councillor in 1973, a long, long time ago. In 1978, I was pregnant. And I went off and demanded 6 months maternity leave, no rights whatsoever. And I think I sort of so shook our then leader that he said, OK, you can have it, Margaret. And I went off, had my baby. But in those days, we used to vote for people to run bits of the council. And I chaired the housing committee here in Islington. And their way of getting back at me was when I returned to the job 6 months later with my baby, they voted me out of office. Now, that was 40 years ago. Yet in taking evidence for this commission that I've got, the Fawcett Society, what has absolutely shaken me is the number of women at our open evidence session who have talked about having leading positions as cabinet members on local authorities and losing them the moment they have a baby. That's so 40 years on, a battle I thought I'd won in the 70s is still as relevant today as it was then. And the other thing that has shocked me on this commission, looking just at local authorities, is that we've done a survey. It was a postal survey. We got about a 12% response rate, which is not bad for these things. And what came out of it was a third of women said that they experienced sexism on their council. 4 out of 10 experienced sexism actually in their political parties, and that was across the spectrum, and 1 in 10 had experienced sexual harassment. So here we are, supposed to be voices in political parties of leadership, and yet we are behaving in ways within those parties which are utterly and totally unacceptable in the modern world. So the challenge is huge. It's a shocking finding. And I think there's a complacency actually in the UK. I think we always think we've done it, we know about it, we're better at it than everywhere else. Looking at women's representation, the best country in the world on women's representation, according to the UN, is Rwanda, with over 60% of the elected representatives are women. And we come down at sort of 49th. So stop being complacent, stop being arrogant, start really understanding the issues we face and tackle them. That's my first point. The second point I wanted to make was really about my own life, really. I've now been around for 45 years, over 40 years. My most successful have been my most recent years. And I think in an odd way, we're a culture which always celebrates youth. Everything is about, we're looking for the new young people, the new ideas, those that are, we're looking at new talent emerging. And actually for women's lives, that doesn't work. And I think we've got to start changing that conversation. We're in for it. Life for me has been a marathon. It's not a short sprint. And in those days when you're just sort of beginning to feel that you've got to take the next promotion, because otherwise you'll fall off that ladder of trying to reach the top, those are probably the very days when you're also struggling with real caring responsibilities in the home for children, if not for elderly parents. And we've just got to alter that. It is a marathon. I didn't become an MP till I was 50. I've been my most successful in my late 60s and early 70s. And the world is changing around us. We're all living longer. Everybody's going to work for much longer. Technology is impacting on the way we work, so physical capacity is less important, becomes less important over time in the workplace, and mental capacities do. And I think we've just got to challenge that. And I actually challenge it in the way we respond. I probably shouldn't be dyeing my hair to try and remain youthful. I don't know what the colour of my hair is. I certainly wouldn't ever use Botox, and I wouldn't have facelifts. But I do think this, and I say this to all of you, don't damage your lives today because you feel there's no tomorrow. And I think as women think about time in their lives, you ought to realise that you can actually achieve over time. Now, let me just talk a little bit about us in Parliament. When I first became an MP in 1994, legend had it that there were more male MPs whose first name was John than there were women members of Parliament. Now we've gone from, 1 in 10 when I started to 1 in 3. I was the 165th woman ever to have been in Parliament. That's a pretty shocking fact in 1994. And when I first came to Parliament, my first observation was that there were hardly any women's loos, and that the only ironing board in the whole of the Palace of Westminster was in that very single women's loos. Now, we've got a few more loos, and I don't know whether actually the men have got an iron and an ironing board, because I've never been into their rooms, but I doubt it even today. Women in Parliament do make a difference. We really have made a difference. I think people write off those Blair Brown years. But at that time, when there was a real critical mass of women, not just as ministers, but in number 10, in the Parliamentary Labour Party, right across the whole structure, we really did actually change the agenda in a huge number of ways, some of which have lasted. So childcare strategy would never have happened if we hadn't fought it. It just wouldn't have happened. When I was Children's Minister, talk about this was the new frontier of the welfare state. Now, the current government has destroyed lots of it, but it's still there. They have to make pledges around childcare, empty as they are, in a way that just wouldn't have happened if we weren't there. Violence against women was an issue that was actually grasped by the women in those Labour years. Ensuring that money didn't just go to the wallet but went to the purse when we talked about benefit restructuring. That was a struggle that the women in Parliament were able to do. Better maternity leave, all those things with stuff we did. And the one that sticks to me is the right to request flexible working, which I think has been the most transformative change for women in balancing their lives between their work and their careers. That I was part of the bunch of people that really thought that was the next important step. Huge hostility for it from both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, because they thought it would upset the whole of the business community and be deeply destructive to the economy. And it was just because we were persistent, as this small bunch of ministers, people in number 10, and a number of people in the women in the Parliamentary Labour Party, that in the end we just sheer persistence and being dogged about it, got it through. And I think it has been the most important. And it's great actually now to see it being, of course you get more out of your workforce if you allow flexible working. And it's now totally commonplace and not destructive at all. But again, we can't assume that the changes that we achieved are embedded. And I want to tell two stories about this. One is a family story. So maternity rights, I thought my generation had sorted that and that maternity rights were really clearly there. Now, among my children, one of my daughters works for a local authority. When she was pregnant with her second child, they tried to make her redundant. And it was only when I threatened I'd pay for the lawyer that would change. My daughter-in-law worked for a private sector law firm in Leeds, and she was given an offer she couldn't refuse the day before she had her baby. And my niece works for a voluntary sector organisation in Camden, so that's private, public and voluntary. And she had to have IVF treatment. And she actually was made redundant because she took too much time off work. So those rights that I thought were a victory to my generation are still contested today. And my other story is another one. When I was culture minister and I got the job, and one of the things you do is you appoint people to boards, the boards of the National Gallery and the Royal Festival Hall and things like that. And of course, where were we? 26% of the appointments were women. So I just decided I was going to turn that round. And of course, there are masses of talented and appropriate people that you could appoint to that. I faced huge resistance within the bureaucracy, overcame that. Within a year, got it up to 46%. I then had to take a year out because my husband was terminally ill and came back after he had died to the same job, to find that within that year it had reverted to 26%. So even though I had thought I'd introduced something, it happened to me. So the struggle goes on. What do we need? Positive action. I hope that's something that we will keep talking about. I wish we didn't. We do, and where it doesn't happen, nothing changes. We need transparency. We need to call this out the whole time. There's too much. The more we can have transparency, the more we will shame people into taking action. We have to continue to tackle the barriers to women participating, whether it's childcare in particular. I mean, we all struggle with balancing my life. When I first became an MP, I was the MP for Barking. I wanted to show the people at Barking I was working really hard for them. And the only way you could do it was on Prime Minister's questions every week. If you sat behind the Prime Minister, they would think you were working really hard. Absolute rubbish, really. But they thought that. So Tony Blair had just become leader. We were opposition. And I went and sat behind him. Felt really pleased. Had a nice sort of power jacket on. Felt it was all great. And in those days, we had pagers. We didn't have mobiles. It was in 1994. Sitting there, Prime Minister's question starts, suddenly my pager goes off, and it's my daughter who's supposed to be at home revising for her GCSEs. Ring mum, urgent. So I think, oh my God, she set fire to the house, she's going to tell me she's pregnant, and all the worst possible things. So I go out, phone her up and say, what has happened, Anna? And she says, oh no, nothing, mum, I just wanted to see whether you had your pager on silent. So that's the troubling balance. So we do have to tackle the barriers. We do have to tackle the culture. I think, the cultures that are confrontational are not ones in which women feel comfortable, and it's the politics that have to change, not the women. We have to constantly be aware of that. I do think we have to have a sisterhood. Supporting each other has been the most important in all my life. I went to the very early feminist consciousness raising groups in the 1960s, and I've been in them ever since, whether it's networking, whether it's mentoring. I always look at the women behind me to see how I can support them in bringing them up. And I think it's a really important lesson for all of us. And I think you have to work across boundaries. So I am happier quite often working with conservative women than I am with some of my most ghastly old-style men in the Labour Party. And then the final thing is we have to defend the advantage. Don't just presume that because we have gained power in some contexts, that is secure. And I think my final thing, the motto that makes me, it's actually a Martin Luther King motto, but it's really important for all of us women. We've got to continue caring. And I think this is true. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Thanks very much indeed.
That's it from this episode. Next week you'll hear from the Women's Seminar panel, Lindsay Hilsum, Layla Hussein, Karen Mattison, Amanda Gardner and our token man, Dexter Diaz. If you want to contribute to the discussion or have an inspiring story you'd like to share of personal triumphs, let us know in the comments section on this podcast's Guardian page or on Twitter @Guardian Audio. This podcast was produced by Rowan Slaney. I'm Zoe Williams. Thank you so much for listening.